Thank you very much indeed. And I'd just like to thank you very much indeed. I'd like to say thank you very much to the organisers of the conference for inviting me to be here. It's a great honour for me to be here.
The last minute is in English.
Yes, okay. So you might think that it's rather strange that I'm going to be talking about multilingual education, home language and bilingual and trilingual education coming from an African context. You might think it's very strange in this part of the world. The situation is that in Africa, most children experience home language, bilingual and trilingual education of some form or another. It's the kind of education that is actually implemented throughout the schooling systems. In other words, it is in fact mainstream education for most children in Africa. We have been doing research on trilingual and multilingual education in Africa for more than 120 years. In fact, since the time that the Europeans at the Conference of Berlin in 1894 and 1895 partitioned Africa into a number of countries, and then various European powers took control over a number of countries in Africa. Primarily, the British took control over 19 countries of Africa, and the French took control over 20. And then the Portuguese took control over at least 3 countries, and so on. Now, what we've learned from research on language education in Africa is that you can either use language as an instrument for exclusion, or you can use language as an instrument for inclusive education. And essentially, what we know from the first 50, 60 years of research on education in Africa in the last century is that during the colonial period, language policies were used for exclusion. They were not used for democratic purposes. And subsequent to the gaining of independence across Africa, various countries have been trying to find appropriate ways of building inclusive education systems, which mean including the languages spoken by various different communities of people living in Africa. Many of these are minority communities, but most of them, in fact, are majority communities. We used to think that language was about the most important thing in education in Africa. We're now beginning to realize that there is a connection between language, culture, and epistemology. That when we talk about the home language and the language of the immediate community, we need to understand concepts like the mother tongue, first language, local language. But we also need to understand that for many children mix their languages if they live in multilingual communities. So we need to understand things about the repertoire of language. We also need to understand that spoken language is not the same as written language. That learning to read any language is different from learning to speak that language. What we're beginning to understand in Africa is that teaching the local or the home language and the international languages in school means something very different from learning how to speak those languages in the community. Schools are institutions. They're like hospitals, courts, executive boardrooms, governments, universities. And the language in institutions is usually different from community language use. We also recently really started to understand that the epistemological foundations of the schooling system is really important. Whose epistemology is included in the education system? Most systems ignore the contextual implication of the epistemologies. And in our circumstances in Africa, what has happened in most of the curriculum developments over the last century or more is that we have borrowed very heavily from European curriculum, European epistemologies, and we have ignored indigenous knowledge systems. Now, there have been a number of significant UNESCO reports and policies. The very first one that has particular relevance for Africa was the report on the use of the vernacular in education in 1953. This was just before the first movements towards independence in various countries of Africa. It was another 50 years before the ministers of education, in other words, pretty much 40 to 50 years after independence, that the ministers of education decided that they needed to investigate more closely the provision of mother tongue and bilingual education in each of the countries of the continent. This resulted in a 25-country study that was conducted between 2005 and 2006 called Optimizing Learning and Education in Africa, the Language Factor, and it was a study on mother tongue and bilingual education in sub-Saharan Africa. And as a result of the findings of this study, UNESCO published a policy and advocacy document in 2010 called Why and How Africa Should Invest in African Languages and Multilingual Education. And then that, what happened was that the 2006 report was then updated with more recent research and edited into a volume which is available on the internet through the UNESCO website. This has gone too quickly. Okay, so this is a summary of 100 years of research on bilingual and multilingual education across Africa. And just to emphasize again, this is education that takes place in the mainstream schooling systems of the continent. These are not, with the exception of one example in Nigeria, these actually happen across the system. They're not just experiments with a group of schools or a small body of schools. So the first research really relates to different kinds of mother tongue and bilingual education that was conducted in South Africa beginning in the 1930s. And this is mother tongue and bilingual education relating to two languages, English and Afrikaans. Afrikaans is a language that developed out of Dutch in South Africa. Afrikaans is a Creole language. In the study that started in the 1930s, the researchers did not include African languages at that point. Later research in Nigeria in the 1970s did relate to an experiment in which children were placed in schools which were very well resourced and taught through the medium of Yoruba for 6 years of primary school before they were required to transfer into or transition into English medium schools. And we found in that study that the children who had 6 years of mother tongue medium plus 6 years of learning English as a subject only, those children did very well in the exams at the end of year 6. They did better than children who had had 3 years of mother tongue and 3 years of English medium instruction during their primary school. So the children who had longer mother tongue medium did better across the curriculum at the end of the grade 6 period of primary school, and also they did better in English as a subject. They did better than in English as a subject than the children who had transitioned into English medium in the 4th grade of school. But as people have mentioned in the first part of the discussions today, policymakers don't always implement the research findings that the researchers as discovered. So in Nigeria, the policymakers did not in fact take up this research. Now we've had other longitudinal study in various parts of the continent which show the failure of early exit from the mother tongue into either English or French or Portuguese as the medium of instruction. Now most of this takes place with children who have 1 or 2 or 3 years of mother tongue instruction, and then they transition into the European language, also known as the international language in Africa. So our longitudinal research confirms that most children now receive some form of bilingual or multilingual education. For many children, this is the mother tongue plus the international language, but also for many children it is mother tongue plus a regional language and plus an international language. Very much like the schools here, where you have home language Kazakh, Russian, the regional language, and English, the international language. So most children in Africa, in fact, have this kind of provision in some form or another. What we found is that the longer the use of the mother tongue as a medium of instruction, the higher the student retention through school and the higher their levels of achievement. We found that 3 years of mother tongue medium is better than no mother tongue medium. 4 years of mother tongue medium increases opportunities to remain in primary school to the end of primary. 6 years of mother tongue medium increases opportunities to reach secondary school. 8 years offers best chances to reach the end of secondary school successfully. 3 languages may be more beneficial than 2 languages. Now, one of the problems that parents have raised and governments have raised in Africa is surely we should not be giving the children too many languages to learn in the curriculum. In fact, all the evidence is showing that not only are 2 languages better than 1, but 3 languages may be better than 2. We've also found that children can learn 2 or 3 orthographies successfully. So, for example, most children will have Latin. In Ethiopia, for example, and also in Eritrea, they will have Ethiopic. And there are other African language scripts, and including Arabic, because Arabic is the Arabic script is used for a number of African languages, and obviously it's also used for purposes of faith-based literacy practices. Now the main studies here, these are the main findings of a study of a medium of instruction in Ethiopian schools across 11 regions in Ethiopia. Now Ethiopia is very interesting. There are about 86 million people who live in Ethiopia. Very much like what has happened in Kazakhstan and also the former Soviet Union is that educational changes and political changes came in 1990. And educational reform occurred very shortly after that. And so new educational policy was announced in 1994. And between 1994 and 2011, the country moved from the use of Harik as a medium of instruction in primary school to the use of 32 languages as mediums of instruction in the primary school, with a switch over in secondary school to English medium. What we found in Ethiopia is, Ethiopia is a very poor country, and this was a curriculum change, a policy and a curriculum change that was put in place over a very short period of time in a very poor country of the world. In 1990, Ethiopia was the second poorest country in the world. But we found in Ethiopia that students can learn 2 or 3 languages, 2 scripts, Ethiopic and Latin, and also in the eastern regions of Ethiopia, they also learn Arabic. So they can learn 2 or 3 scripts between the 1st grade and the 8th grade. In fact, they start to learn 2 scripts from pretty much in the first 2 years of school. Students learning 3 languages through primary achieve higher scores across the curriculum. So this is very interesting because some children in Ethiopia only have to learn 2 languages because in Ethiopia, if you are a speaker of Amharic, you just have to learn Amharic and English. But if you happen to speak one of the other languages, you have to be able to speak your home language, Amharic and English, 3 languages. So we can compare the children who only have to learn Amharic and English with those who have 3 languages. And in Ethiopia, the children with 3 languages do better than the children who are only learning Amharic and English. Students with 8 years of mother tongue medium achieve the highest score in the sciences. Students with 8 years of mother tongue medium have the highest overall achievement across the curriculum, the best opportunities of retention through the end of secondary school, and the best opportunity to reach higher education. Students with a mix of some subjects for 6 years in their home language and some subjects for 8 years in the home language have the highest achievement in English language as a subject scores. Children with 6 years of mother tongue medium or a mix of 6 and 8 years, some subjects for 6 years, some subjects for 8 years of mother tongue medium, achieve the highest scores in mathematics. In other words, what we found in Ethiopia is that children seem to need somewhere between 6 years and 8 years in the mother tongue in order to be able to achieve well in the sciences and in mathematics. The earlier introduction of English medium is accompanied by a declining achievement in English across the curriculum. Now this is very similar to what we found in South Africa in the 1950s, because in South Africa between the 1950s and 1970s, we found that children who had 8 years of mother tongue medium stayed in the schooling system to the end of secondary school, did well in... Sorry.
Can I just ask you a question? I'm not sure that translation on the slides is good. Maybe translators are translating right. Here you have told that the students with mother tongue medium at age of 6 and...
No, not age of 6.
It is
6 years of
and
mother
8
tongue
years,
medium
yes.
and
Okay,
8 years
okay.
of mother tongue
Good,
medium.
good. Thank you.
So they will be having mother tongue medium up to the end of grade 6
Yes,
or the
it's
end of
good.
grade 8. Is that right? So in South Africa, we found that during a period where African language speaking children had 8 years of mother tongue medium, learning English as a subject, they did better than children now in South Africa, where they have reduced the number of years of African languages as a medium, and they have made English as the medium of instruction much earlier. So the students' achievement at the end of secondary school in South Africa was much higher by the mid-1970s than it is today in the 21st century, after they've reduced the number of years of mother tongue medium. So what else did we find in Ethiopia which was really important? We found that because Ethiopia is a very poor country, the Federal Ministry of Education could not implement the curriculum across the whole country on its own. So it had to decentralize some of the administration to the regions, and then to decentralize further to the zones, then to the waridas, which is the district level, and then to the kebeles, which is the village level. Now this resulted in the localization of language development. It meant that people in the communities got involved in the process of helping to develop orthographies and in helping to develop writing materials. what this also did was it stimulated local industry, local language industry actually. So local printing businesses developed, children were able to take books home, and now this is a very strange thing. You probably would not understand this from the Kazakhstan position, but in Africa not many children take books home. And in Ethiopia, even though it was a very poor country, children were able to take books home shortly after they implemented the change. It also resulted in economic enterprises which were related to education. So it stimulated a whole lot of educational activities. It also resulted in parental or community involvement, a very high level of community involvement in the schooling system across the country. And so, for example, communities would set aside some land and they would develop plantations, and then they would sell the produce in order to help fund the school buildings and bring resources into the school. However, we also found that the closer we got to the country's capital city, Addis Ababa, where the resources were much greater than in the rural areas, parents stopped being involved in the schooling of their children, because parents and the communities believed that because they were in the city or the urban areas around the main city, that government would do everything. So parents didn't feel that they had to be involved. What was interesting was that the student achievement around Addis Ababa was very, very low compared to student achievement in the remote rural areas. So where the parents were very much involved, so too was student achievement very high. Now moving to northwest Uganda, it's an area which has been affected by 30 years of civil conflict, terrible human rights abuse, and it's on the border with South Sudan and then also with the Democratic Republic of Congo. And although in northwest, in Uganda, educational reform was supposed to take place shortly after 1990 in response to the UNESCO Education for All goals and commitments that were made in 1990, the country was very slow to get curriculum change activated. And what happened was a small non-government organization called Literacy and Adult Basic Education that had been working with women's education started to work in this very difficult area in the northwest part of the country where the government administrators did not wish to go because they were afraid of the insurgents and the conflict in that area. And what the NGO was able to do was it was able to work with village representatives and parent educators, school principals and teachers. They managed to work with the district teacher education, district education officials. And eventually what happened was they were working with the National Curriculum Development Office in Kampala, which is the capital of Uganda. And they, through the practices that they established, they were able to work with the National Curriculum Development Center to develop a National Teacher Development Guide, which is now being used and rolled out across the country. I won't talk about the pretty pictures because I have to move on. But what we found in this process in Uganda is that multi-stakeholder collaboration is really important. That the NGO led a rural project. It links adult education and primary education together. What has happened is enrollment and retention has increased. It's built stakeholder capacity, multi-stakeholder capacity and buy-in. And this is incredibly important to accompany curriculum change, that there's multiple forms of stakeholder involvement and participation. There were a number of unexpected results. Parents who had not been at school for 30 years started going to school and becoming involved in their children's education, actually participating in reading classes in the school and in the village. The villages established home learning centers, which resulted in establishing little ways of supporting children to do homework and also to develop early childcare facilities in the village. And then the parents and the communities then established their own adult literacy and numeracy programs, and this resulted in village savings schemes, microeconomic enterprises. And so what you've got is this capacity development in the very remote rural areas accompanying curriculum change, the curriculum change that has actually happened basically from the bottom up. It supports national interests, and there is this sort of filtering way of moving from the bottom to the top and the bottom and from the top downwards. Now I'm going to talk about language used in assessment in South Africa. There's been 100 years of bilingual English and Afrikaans assessment in South Africa. It's, English and Afrikaans assessment has been used system-wide for high-stakes exit at the end of secondary school. And the way in which students have been assessed is that you get exam papers. And on the one side, the exam questions are written in one language, and on the other side, the exam question is written in the other language. So students who are bilingual can actually read the exam paper in both languages if they want to. This was also during the period of apartheid, and apartheid had two different periods to it, 1955 to 1976 and 1977 to 1994. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about post-apartheid language policy. Essentially, it is meant to be a multilingual policy, but the assessment practices do not match the policy. And then I'm going to talk to you about a trilingual assessment and what we've learned from that. So during apartheid, there was multilingual education and assessment. Mother tongue medium was used for all children who enrolled in school, and the enrollment increased from a very low base. There were multiple parallel assessments to the end of the 8th grade. Then the highest, as I mentioned earlier, the highest secondary school pass rate for African language speaking students was in 1978, after they had had 8 years of mother tongue medium education. After 1978, the mother tongue medium was reduced from 8 years to 4 years, and achievement of speakers of African languages has declined since that point. In the post-apartheid education, apartheid ended formally in 1994, and a whole lot of new policies came into being, but new education policy was formulated in 1997. So we have a new multilingual policy, but we're still carrying on with bilingual assessment in English and Afrikaans. We're not assessing students in their home languages if they're speakers of African languages. And the achievement for students who are African language speakers has been catastrophic. In 2006, I was involved in an experimental trilingual assessment of students. So what we tried to do in one particular province of South Africa was to assess the students in Afrikaans, English, and Xhosa versions, in their languages and in their mathematics. The attempt was to find a more equitable and valid testing for African language speakers in a dominant English Afrikaans system. Now, just to give you an idea of the difference in achievement, if you see the dotted line, the dotted line shows you the achievement of students at the end of their 6th year of school. And the dotted line is the students who are assessed or tested in their home language, English and Afrikaans. So the different figures relate to the different provinces in South Africa. The last figure, 69%, is the national average achievement of students whose home language is either English or Afrikaans. If you see the solid line at the bottom, the final figure, 32%, is the national average achievement of students whose home languages are African languages. They are being tested in English, not in their home language. The English and Afrikaans speakers are tested in their home language. By 2005, the African language speakers at grade 6 were being tested in English. And you can see the gap in achievement, which is completely catastrophic, because those students carry on in the schooling system, but if there's only a 32% pass rate there, you can imagine what happens in terms of their success beyond that. So this is very briefly, I'll show you one item in the trilingual assessment that I was involved with the Human Sciences Research Council. What we did was we worked on the assumption that students are learning 3 languages in school. They're learning their home languages, Xhosa, English and Afrikaans. Mostly African children will be tested in Afrikaans. And so what we did was, in our assessments, we had items, I know I've got to stop. If you see, we didn't separate the languages in the assessments. We included 3 languages in the assessment. So this is actually the English instrument, but we've got a translation in Xhosa and in Afrikaans. And then in the Afrikaans assessment, we had translation in Xhosa and in English. What we found was, because we collected data, the students actually read all 3 languages. They used the languages that they had, even if it was meant to be an English-only test. They used whatever Xhosa they had, whatever Afrikaans they had, and in the items where we had the 3 languages present, the students all did achieve higher success in those items. And we also found that most of the students found the use of 3 languages in each item very helpful, because they used the 3 languages, and this was a way of actually drawing on 3 languages simultaneously. So, okay, so what are the possible implications for education in Kazakhstan? The first or home language medium of education is necessary for all children from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. Bilingual, trilingual proficiency is becoming essential for communities around the world. It's not just in a few countries. And it means for most children home language, regional language, and international language. Parents often believe that if their children receive mother tongue medium education, that this will prevent competitive access to the regional and international languages and future economic prospects. However, what we have found is that success in bilingual and trilingual models changes public opinion. Decentralization of education authority increases opportunities for parental community participation, and increased community participation increases students' achievement and community empowerment, and trilingual assessment permits a broader and more holistic assessment of students' capabilities. Thank you very much.